Hi, my name's William Henderson,
And I'm B. McGraw.
and this is the Unjerked podcast. So, our podcast is the inverse of B. McGraw's website, which is
The Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or JABD.com.
so instead of purposely putting out fake journal articles, what we do is we try to find real journal articles to talk about different topics that are often discussed erroneously online. In this case, we're talking specifically about academic research, or more broadly, R&D in general. So right up your alley.
Yep, I was actually thinking about it while I was working on an article today. Article I'm working on right now is Real-Time Naughty Niceless Updating Procedure with Postmodern Graph-Based Morality Adjustment by Santa Claus. And he had to do a triple-blind study because he found his elves were de-hacking the data so that they wouldn't get demoted to quality assurance.
Unfortunate that had to happen, but
I know. Triple blind studies that could solve our problems.
So, I guess what would you say are sort of some things people say in reference to research in general? What are some common complaints people have online?
So, it's more of suspicions. Suspicions like the ones that come from p-hacking or from who's funding this research. Is it a corporation just trying to make money? Does that put the thumb on their thumb on the results, or is the positivity bias producing a replication crisis where we're putting out so much research that it's less trustworthy, and we should be being harder on our own research and maybe actually trying to replicate it and put more money into that. And there's just so much noise out there that people don't know what research to trust, or they just can't blindly trust in science anymore.
Another thing I hear is, if there's some silly research item that was researched in some random news article, people say like, oh, why are we spending government money, taxpayer money on XYZ instead of fixing healthcare? That's kind of something I hear is people complaining about the misallocation of funding research, basically.
Yep, there's a lot of that. There's the famous Portlandia sketch where the two main characters are haunted by ghosts, quoting contradictory dietary studies about how, oh, pretzels are good for you. No, pretzels are bad for you. They're carbs, and it goes back and forth till they go crazy. It's a pretty funny sketch.
So, what does research look like across the globe? So, right off the bat, what are your general thoughts? Unless you already looked at the show notes.
I looked at them a little bit. Not too many surprises there.
So, yeah, not super surprising. I think when you look at percent of global R&D by region, it basically mirrors, the economic output of the globe.
Yep.
So, 39% East Asia and Southeast Asia. That's actually higher than I expected.
Well, they have a lot of people, so
yeah,
that might have something to do with it.
Granted, China is a huge economy, so that makes sense. Japan's also there. Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, all very advanced. So, 27% North America, not surprising.
Yeah, we're the best.
21% Europe, and then after that it drops precipitously. Every other region is like 1 to 3% each. South America, Middle East, South Asia, Central Asia, Africa, Australia, Oceania, etc.
What is this percentage? Research units?
It's I think it's R&D dollars.
Okay. Reminds
Not
me
sure.
That, one graph that circulates the internet all the time where science just drops down in the Dark Ages and then comes back in the Renaissance, and the y-axis is something like research units. It's just ill-defined. Major graph crime.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is adjusted for purchasing power, because I know in less wealthy countries, researchers, I assume, get paid less. So I'm not sure if it accounts for that. Regardless, I'm surprised by South Asia, because I thought India would have a pretty large output. But that's kind of what you see, is like East Asia, North America, Europe basically dominate global R&D. When we look at percentage of GDP by country, so that's essentially a measure of how much of your output as a country is research and development. So let's start with the US. So the US is 2.8%. So we're actually very much on the high end. And there's not many countries higher than us. I listed 6. I think these are the only 6. They might not.
You listed Austria twice.
Yeah, I did. So one of those numbers is wrong. Okay. These are a large, I would say about 70% of the data for this episode comes from the National Science Foundation, which is a U.S. government research agency. So I consider them a credible source, but that's what I'm using. So yeah, ignoring listing Austria twice. So Israel is by far the highest.
That is very high.
4.54%. And
wow.
I know they have a huge startup scene there.
What are they researching?
I don't know, because I know oftentimes military spending is correlated with R&D, just because, especially development, but also...
That would make sense. Yeah.
And they do spend a lot. They do have a big military focus there, just because of the nature of, that whole situation.
That geopolitical mess they are in the middle of. Yeah.
So that's very high. A lot of the Germanic countries are also high. Sweden at 3.4. Switzerland is semi-Germanic at 3.37. Austria around 3%. Germany around 3%. Most European countries are actually quite a bit lower than the US. I only included the UK as a comparable just because it's similar to the US in many ways as far as culture goes. UK was at 1.6%, so quite a bit lower than the US. If we're looking at sort of, internet, multinational organizations, the OECD is at 2.37%. So a little lower than the US. The EU is at 1.97%. So most of Europe actually spends less on R&D. Ireland was a good example. It was very, very low, even though Ireland's a wealthy country, because a lot of their GDP comes from sort of like being a tax haven. That's just reality. China is at 2.15%. So a little lower than the US, but they also have a very large economy. So, China de facto is basically, the top. I don't know if they're number 2, but they probably are in terms of amount of research and development done. There might be some other country. And then Russia, this surprises me. Russia's only at 1.11%. So Russia actually has a quite low R&D expenditure. And this surprises me because they do have, say what you will about Russia, they do have a pretty extensive history of scientific inquiry. Obviously they had a huge, robust space program for a long time. As long as a certain research area was sort of aligned with the interests of, the Soviet Union's goals, they would have very heavy investment. So I'm surprised that right now Russia actually isn't heavily, isn't a huge R&D country.
Yeah, that is interesting. I wonder what caused that drop.
Yeah,
got the AK-47 and didn't need to perfect it any further.
Yeah, I guess they just, make the good cheap version of something and it just ends there. So if you look at, in R&D, an interesting thing about R&D that doesn't apply to the same degree in other areas of business is essentially who funds the research and who does the research. Because a lot of times those two numbers are not the same. And so when you look at, there's a good graph I found. Okay, I can't find it right now, but there's a very good graph that looks at, who basically funds research versus who performs research. And I mean, off the top of your head, what are the different categories that you can think of as far as like who does research or who funds research?
Who funds it?
Either.
Government. You would have endowments, businesses. I'm sure the category for out of academic curiosity alone is pretty low. I don't know. What else?
I mean, that's basically it. Yeah. So, business, government, academia is more or less it. There's no clear trend. I was actually surprised at how much total R&D is done by business. And this is basic research, applied research, and development. If you put
surprised
it all
as in you thought it was going to be higher or lower?
I thought it would be lower.
Huh. Really?
I don't know. Maybe I just had different priors or different assumptions.
You just love business so much.
There's nothing obvious as far as like what separates one from another. Like one assumption I thought was like, well, China's a communist country, so they probably have a much higher, government performance or funding sort of trend. But that's actually not the case. China's numbers were more or less similar to the US numbers. They actually had more R&D done by business percentage-wise compared to the US. And then when it came to funding, it was even higher. So I found that interesting. I found that kind of unexpected. The only obvious outlier is India had a much higher government performing percentage. So India had a lot less, business doing R&D versus government doing R&D. And they also had a very, very low higher education doing R&D. So in India, there's just a big focus on the government doing R&D, which is quite a bit different from other countries.
Yeah, I wonder why that is. I don't know enough about Indian culture to
I cannot claim to be an expert on, Indian economic policies or anything. So
you could claim that, but you just have too much integrity.
Yeah, I'd be lying if I claimed that. But I heard that they do have. Yeah, I'm not going to even speculate. So so when it comes to what in your words, what's the difference between basic versus applied research as well as development?
Well, basic research, I would assume would be something like just general research in mathematics or, kind of your like harder scientists, more kind of discovery focus, kind of the backbone to future discoveries or new technologies, while development, I would assume, would be maturing things at lower technology readiness levels, stuff that was discovered in basic research. And
you mean applied, not development?
Wait.
Because there's basic research, applied research, and development.
Okay, what is the difference between applied and development then?
So according to this page on the NIH website, the NIH is the National Institute of Allergy and it's the National Institute of Health. This is the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, which is a government agency in the US. It says basic research is a systematic study directed towards greater knowledge or understanding of the fundamental aspects of phenomena and of observable facts without specific applications towards process or products in mind. Long way of saying no real end goal other than learning new things. So I think a lot of physics, there's a lot of basic research in physics. If you're learning about, learning about quarks or like how valid is strings.
Smashing particles together.
So like, yeah. Why are you learning about quarks, or why are you building a space telescope to look at different planets?
Just to learn things.
Just to learn things. That's the point of it.
That's how I imagine that. Yep.
And I think my defense of basic research for people who say it's useless is like basic research feeds into applied research, which feeds into development, which feeds into production, which feeds into products and services that we all use. So,
and it's also the argument I use for when people argue against there's no reason to bring dinosaurs or other extinct animals back from the dead is because it would be cool, and basic research is cool and just interesting to learn more about the universe.
So applied research is like, we know what we want to use this research for. So if you're, researching, you're doing some sort of materials research and you're like, hey, we want to create materials that are more resistant to, high heat because we can use that in all sorts of applications. We can use it in hypersonic vehicles. We could use it to kind of, protect buildings in fires, etc. That's applied research, right? It's like, hey, we want to learn more about this thing because of this reason, because we could use it for this. And then development, I would say, is just you have, the fundamentals of how the technology works. You're just basically refining it into a prototype product. So it's like, hey, we understand how we can use this to make something useful. Let's actually make the first version of a thing. So you're developing, a prototype, machine or software or something. And then when we leave R&D is when we go into production, where you're actually like, it's like, okay, we know how to make a prototype. Now, how do we mass produce this? How do we tool the machinery? How do we like figure out the supply chains and, all that stuff. So production, which is an entirely different discipline, which is difficult itself. It's not an easy thing to do. In fact, Elon Musk, say what you will about his recent behavior, there's an interesting quote he gave where he said that like production is like 100 or 1,000 times harder to do than R&D. Just like it just being able to profitably make something at scale is very difficult to do. So, just respecting the production side of things. That said, not really the focus of this podcast. So anyways, with all that said, are there any trends in the big countries in terms of, do they focus on basic research, applied research, development? What do you think?
I'd imagine most research would be in development, then applied, then basic being least.
Basically, yeah. So it depends on the country, but we're only looking at, the top eight or so countries. And development ranges from 35 to 84% of like all, like basically if you're saying what percent is basic, what percent is applied, what percent is development, it's basically 35 to 84. Applied is about 10 to 44. Basic is about 5 to 21 or so. So I think part of that also is like when you're doing basic research, you just don't need as much equipment, maybe you have a small test setup. Maybe you're just doing everything in your head if you're a theoretician. Maybe you're just doing it all in your head.
Or just in simulation.
Yeah. So I think, one interesting thing is China is 84% in development. So their R&D is a lot more development focused.
Mm-hmm.
And France, interestingly, spends more on applied research than development. So they're 41% applied. UK is similar, 44% applied. So they have a huge emphasis on applied research. And that is essentially the trend you see. So
I'd
kind of
imagine
interesting.
the reason why more money is spent on applied and development research is because there are just more questions to answer, while basic research has nebulous or nondescript questions. There's not as many of them, but taking a discovered scientific process into something that's applied or will get you to the moon, there's a lot of little things you have to do.
Yeah, I think there's more sort of
It's just more work.
Niche. There's more just niche questions. That's why you eventually reach a point where, like, in business, you just don't write white papers. I mean, you do some of that, but like at a certain point, it's like, okay, you're trying to find out this like very niche one-off situation. Like, what do? You're not going to write, do a double-blind study and, write a paper on that. You're just going to do it.
Yeah, you
right?
Just have to design the best door handle for your Suburban pickup.
Yeah. So that said, I do think a big driver is like the more advanced you go from basic to applied to development to production, the more and more capital intensive it gets. You need more people, you need more equipment, it just costs more, right? Whereas basic, a lot of it's maybe in your head or, your desk, you have a computer and you're doing simulations or maybe a small test setup. When it comes to defense versus non-defense, so that's another interesting category, obviously. So the US, it's about 43.6% defense. So about half of our R&D is in defense.
Is that total or just what the government spends on research?
I think that's total. So it says percent of government budget allocations for R&D. So that's specific to the government. So that's not total.
Okay. But I guess you could infer what that is as total by applying the percent of government spending on.
So U.S. is about half of U.S. government R&D is defense. In the European Union, it is 4.7%. So defense R&D is actually, let me that's basically correct. So European defense R&D is just super small. Japan is the same; it's very low. And when it comes to non-defense government spending, so in the U.S., so let's go category by category. So for economic development, U.S. is 12%, Europe is 22%. So they care a lot more about economic development. US 55.7% health environment. Europe is 14%. For this one, I wonder how much of that is just US funding of like pharma research. Because I know a lot of pharma research is funded by the government.
Yeah, that would make sense. Well, that's one of the arguments that people have for our healthcare system is that we end up coming up with a lot of the healthcare innovations. Mm-hmm. What does economic development research even mean?
So I'm not sure. I'm assuming a lot of it is like, it's like because research is not just science research, it's also social sciences, humanities, etc. And so I think with economic development, it's probably like, hey, let's research which policies are best at, improving, some sort of outcomes in a certain population, like what kind of subsidies help the most, what kind of welfare programs help the most. I assume that's what it is, but I'm kind of guessing. So anyways,
I'm not sure.
Yeah, education 2.5% US, 4.8% Europe. Civil space, 14.2% US, 4.2% Europe. So US does a lot more space research. That's non-defense space research. The US also dominates space defense, or defense space. And 15.7 non-oriented for US, 18% non-oriented for Europe. I assume non-oriented just is a grab bag, of like remaining just miscellaneous science, technology, just, history research, etc. So what we see here is obviously US has a lot more defense R&D stuff. No surprise.
Yep.
Europe focuses a lot more on how do we, develop our economy, or probably more how do we not develop the economy, but just like economic well-being type stuff, researching what works. US spends a lot more on health environment. I'm assuming pharmaceuticals are a big part of that. US focuses a lot more on space. So those are some of the differences. None of those are super surprising, really. When it comes to for academia, so let's say you are a university, right? And you are getting funding from different sources. So where is that money coming from? Do you think there's any obvious patterns between countries? Let me actually...
I imagine some countries would be more government funded and others would have more endowments.
So what you see is, one obvious trend is like there's a huge government involvement in academic research. Virtually every country, most academic research is paid for by the government.
Half for everybody.
Yeah.
Wow.
So when you think about like, okay, who funds academic research in the US? A lot of people, these are not household names, but there's a lot of agencies. The NIH, National Institute of Health, funds a lot of healthcare research for a lot of just exploratory scientific research. There's the NSF, the National Science Foundation. There's obviously the Department of Defense. When it comes to the humanities and the arts, they have their own agencies as well. There's the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts. So those are some of the big agencies, Department of Energy, etc. Interestingly, again, China being a communist country, you would expect it to be dominated by government spending, but they actually have the highest business funding of academic research, at around 20% of academic research being funded by business.
Much higher than everyone else on that list.
Yeah. It's also tough because like a lot of businesses in China are like government owned. So they're like, they're businesses, but they're not. So it's hard to kind of tease that out. When it says higher education sector, so we're looking at a graph.
Wondering about that.
What does that mean?
What that
essentially means, so it's like, okay, academia funds their own research. Where do they get that money? There's an entire industry, there's an entire discipline around endowment funding, but basically universities have endowments. There's an entire thing called, investment management about how to kind of invest in different asset classes for an endowment. When it comes to where does the original money come from that is used to invest? There's obviously student tuition. There's also donations by alumni. There's also, donations by random wealthy people. So that basically creates a huge pool of money that the university uses.
I thought my alumni donation was only going to the football training center.
Yeah, I guess those, horrible people at the university used it to fund academic research instead, which is a shame because, the football stadium.
No wonder my team sucks.
So Other obvious trends, Australia is almost entirely government funded academic research. Japan has a very high sort of higher education, self-funding. So, some other interesting trends. Also, when it comes to the history of R&D funding in the US specifically. So, have you looked at the chart yet?
Which chart?
For the history of R&D funding. Okay.
I have not.
So, since the 50s, what do you think the general trend has been?
Since the 50s, general R&D. My guess is that it's been increasing.
From start to finish, it's been slightly increasing.
Okay.
So yes. So what you see is basically total funding has gone up. And
not by much.
Not by a ton. So in 53, it was about 1.4% or so. And then it peaked basically in 1964 at 2.79% of GDP. And then it dropped all the way to the end of the 70s down to 2.07. And now it's at 2.81. So technically, we just recently, in 2017, so this is 6-year-old data. That said, in 2017, we beat our record in 1964.
All right.
So we actually, recently
are at a new peak.
So people who say, our best R&D days are behind us. I mean, not quite true in terms of actual spending.
I haven't heard anyone say that, but if I do, I'll let them know they're wrong.
The one thing you do see is the ratio between business and federally funded shifts. So at the peak in 1964, federally funded R&D was 1.86% of GDP. Business funding was 0.86. So clearly, federally funding was just dominating. And then now, or in 2017, business funding is 1.95% and federal is 0.62. So federal government funded research has dropped almost nonstop since 1964. What you do see is business funded R&D has been going up very steadily since 1950. So you're kind of seeing an inversion between the two. Very controversial as far as whether this is a good thing or not. Because obviously if a business is incentivized to do its own R&D instead of pulling from taxpayer funds, sounds great.
That is the source of a lot of the circle jerk arguments on why science can't be trusted. Is if it's funded by businesses, then there must be an ulterior motive.
I mean, there's always, I feel like your funding source will always influence something, right? I think the important question is, does the data hold up? That's a fine starting point to say, well, this company funded this research. Let's see if the experiment is reproducible. That's kind of my argument. The other argument is like, if business is funding R&D, are they focusing on what is the most socially beneficial? I mean, a business's goal is to make money. So we shouldn't expect them to only focus on socially beneficial research. So let's try to dig more into US R&D. So there's the performer and then there's the source of funding. So performer of funding in 2017. So in total, there was $547 billion of R&D done in the US across all sectors. Is that higher or lower than you thought?
I don't know if I would have been able to guess.
Yeah. For me, it was a little lower than expected. So 400 billion done by business, 71 billion by academia, 52 billion by the federal government, 23 billion by nonprofits, and then 0.64 billion by non-federal government. So what you see here is state and local government are basically non-existent in the R&D world. which makes sense. But
Yeah, they got to
you
build
know,
their own roads and stuff.
they're very important in a lot of things, when it comes to healthcare, public safety, infrastructure. When it comes to R&D, not really their cup of tea.
No.
Right?
I mean, that makes sense because research would benefit everybody, and not an individual state. So why would they spend money on
Yeah. And do we really want, like, for example, let's say there's a NASA facility in Alabama. I forgot what the city was called. Was that Huntsville? No, or is that a university?
Huntsville's Rocket City.
Yeah. Oh, so Huntsville is that location.
But that is right next to Redstone Arsenal, where the military focused.
So
it's a cool space or Air and Space Museum there.
So should the mayor of Huntsville make R&D funding decisions for that location?
That's a good point.
Yeah, obviously
there was a recent battle over getting Space Force there, I think.
Right, but like
they lost it.
But should the mayor of Huntsville be like, "Hey, you should invest in this, propellant research instead of this propellant research"? It's like that dude has, he has no expertise. I'm sure the mayor of Huntsville is a nice guy or woman, I don't know which, but not their wheelhouse.
And I think that wouldn't happen naturally just from the economies of scale. Like, what are the odds that the state government's going to have the means to make those decisions wisely in the first place?
Yeah. When it comes to source of funding, so we were looking at performer. Now let's look at where the money comes from. So 381 business, 120 federal government, 45 billion other. So what you see is business has a huge presence in R&D. Academia is second when it comes to doing research, and then federal government, so actual federal agencies or affiliated labs, are third. When it comes to where the money comes from, government, so business is number one, federal government is number two. So the money side, the federal government has a huge presence. The doing side, a lot of that is done by academia. When it comes to industry, so not very surprising, 19% chemicals, so that includes pharmaceuticals. So not surprising. Computer electronics, so that's hardware, that's 20%. Information software, 20%. And transportation is 13%. So not surprising, right?
Nah, that makes sense.
I mean, this is basically like what the venture capitalists invest in. They invest in biotech and like software startups, right? When it comes to R&D intensity of industries, so like what percent of an industry's costs do they invest in R&D? So again, it's the same trends, relatively speaking. So scientific R&D service companies, 25% of their money is spent on R&D. Software publishers, 15%. And I assume when they're making new software, it's like, hey, this is our new software, that's probably considered development because you're a software developer, right? So that's probably part of R&D. For pharma companies, it's 14%. For computer electronics hardware companies, it's 11%. So not surprising, right? I mean, it's not like, I don't know, agriculture. I know they have R&D there too, but it's not like ag research is dominating R&D. It's mostly like biotech and like computer software. So when it comes to basic versus applied versus development, the general trend is basic research. There's a huge academia presence. So half of all basic research is done by academia.
That makes the most sense.
Yeah. I mean, that's what an academic is, really. They barely even teach classes. They just phone it in, show up 10 minutes late, and have their TA do all the grading, right? So that's a joke, by the way. Probably only about 30% of professors do that, so less than half.
That's still pretty high.
So source of funding, when it comes to basic research, 42% federal. So what you tend to see is most organizations fund their own research except for academia, which is very often cross-funded by business, by the federal government, by nonprofits, etc. When it comes to applied research, academia drops down to 18%, and it's mostly business by that point, 57% business. Also, the funding is 54% done by business. And then once you're in development, it's almost entirely dominated by business. 90% business, 7% federal government, source of funds, 85% business, 13% federal. So basic research is kind of, much of it is academia funded by everyone else. Applied research is like mostly business, a little mix of the others. Development is like almost entirely business.
Absolutely zero surprises there.
Yeah. Let's dig into agencies within the federal government. So I talked about this before, but which agencies in the government actually fund research? So it's not a ton of surprises. I think a lot of these are not household names. So that might be the one caveat there. But in 2018, $53 billion from the Department of Defense, $37 billion from Health and Human Services, which the NIH is a part of, $15 billion the Department of Energy. A lot of that is nuclear-related stuff. $11 billion NASA, $6.3 billion the National Science Foundation, which is grab bag science research, $2.5 billion Agriculture Department, $1.83 billion Commerce Department, $1 billion Transportation. And then other agencies also were there, but they were just too small to count. The DoD portion of that has been shrinking over time. Others have been relatively steady. So the National Science Foundation almost entirely funds outside research, mostly academia, whereas certain agencies like the Department of Energy, Commerce, Agriculture mostly fund internal research within their own. The Department of Defense is 84% development spending because they have a lot of weapon systems that they're developing. Health and Human Services has almost no development spending. National Science Foundation is 85% basic research. So some differentiators there. And when it comes to what subjects do they fund? So 34 billion life sciences. So the biggest thing they fund is life sciences, mostly. I'm assuming that's pharma, biotech, etc. 13 billion engineering, 6.6 billion physical science, which is chemistry and physics, 4.5 environmental, 3.9 computer science, 4.5 billion other science, 2 billion psychology, 1 billion social science. So when, people in Congress say we need to defund the endowment for the arts or the endowment for the humanities, those guys don't get that much money in the first place.
I mean, it comes back to the, how do you fix the national debt? And people are always arguing over little bitty knobs to fix the problem when it's like very obviously, nope, there's some big knobs over there.
I mean, I do think the research dollars kind of make sense though, because you want to. Yeah. I mean,
in those fields, research dollars feels like they go a lot longer of a way.
Yeah. But like I said, National Endowment for the Humanities, they have an annual budget of 200 million. That's with an M. So 1/5 of $1 billion. National Endowment for the Arts is 162 million with an M. So in comparison, life sciences got 34 billion with a B in funding. So, they just don't get that much money. So all the research into different history, because history, that's legit research. You need historians to look through archives and all that stuff.
It feels like when you're arguing over an Uber ride when you're getting a voucher for a business trip and the conversation costs more than the Uber ride.
Yeah. So big question is why does the government fund research? Because most things, because the government doesn't fund coffee shops, right? You just, Starbucks just opens a store and people go there. So in a capitalist country such as ours, why does the federal government fund so much research? So what are your thoughts?
I mean, a lot of it is common good. Research is generally good for everybody. And on top of that, if the research were to be done by a corporation or a business, then that corporation or business would own the IP. And now that's, so many years before anyone can use it other than the corporation. So probably helps reduce monopolies if you can get a lot of it done without any of those restrictive IP rights. I think we're 3 weeks out before Mickey Mouse is public domain. Speaking of which.
So when Winnie the Pooh went into public domain, they made like a slasher horror movie about it.
I saw that.
Yeah.
I didn't watch it yet, but.
So there's two concepts that are relevant here. So one is a public good. So the two things that make something a public good are that it's non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So non-excludable means you can't stop other people from using it. So air, the atmosphere, is non-excludable. You can't stop someone else from breathing. People breathe. That's just what people do. Everyone uses the same air. Non-rivalrous means so you can't. So non-rivalrous means if you use it, that doesn't prevent someone else from using it. So me breathing doesn't prevent you from breathing. It's just everyone breathes. So I think this applies to a lot of research knowledge, basic research especially. Once an idea is out there, it's just kind of out there. How do you protect the knowledge that atoms are made out of protons and neutrons or whatever? Once that data is out there, it's out there, and you can't really stop people from knowing that once they learn it. And knowing that doesn't really stop other people from knowing it. So I think a lot of knowledge, fundamental knowledge, there's a lot of that public good aspect to it. And I think another part of it is, so there's a thing called an externality, is when there's a transaction and people outside of the transaction get affected. So negative externalities like pollution. So someone is making a good in a factory, someone is buying that item, but there's people who are not buying the item who get affected by the pollution. So the government, regulates and outlaws various negative externalities. And so the amount that the free market creates of something with a negative externality is higher than what the public good demands. A positive externality is the opposite. So the amount that the free market would make is less than what the public good needs. And so basically a positive externality is something where the buyer and the seller are there, but there's also people outside of that transaction who benefit. So I think essentially, research in general, the knowledge, it's very easy for that knowledge to flow out. It's very hard. Like, let's say, someone funds someone to do research for them. That info very easily leaves. I think the strongest example is pharma. It is very, very expensive and very, very difficult to research and develop new drugs. But once drugs are out there, they're much easier to make, like as far as like the actual chemical reaction of creating a compound. Like, I'm not saying it's super easy, but it's relatively easy. And so, were you going to say something?
Well, that's kind of the thing that a lot of people get worried about by a lot of the pharmaceuticals being funded by the corporations, and then they find the life-saving drug, and then they can super raise prices on them because they have the IP. So, yes, that would be much better if we had that mostly in the public sector.
So that's that's not a very easy problem to solve, because I think the whole point, so it's called non-dilutive funding in business. So dilutive funding is like when venture capitalists put money in. and you get their money, but they also get a share in the company. So your ownership gets diluted, diluted, right? And so it's kind of expensive for you, where like, yes, you're getting cash up front, but over the long term, a lot of the money leaves your hands. And so the whole reason that the NIH, for example, funds a lot of these, a lot of this drug R&D is the government's basically saying like, hey, don't worry about the financial impact. We got that covered. Here's the money, and do the R&D. So that removes a lot of the risk for researchers. If you then said, oh, but you don't get the upside, then a lot of companies would say, okay, well, the numbers are back to square one, where, okay, this is high risk. You gave us some money, but we're not going to see a huge upside out of this. What's even the point? So a lot of that is by design, where the government's purposely saying, you will get an outsized return for this, and therefore please do it. It's sort of like we're trying to incentivize companies to do R&D that they otherwise would not do. That said, it's obviously infuriating when you see a company make tons of money from a product that was funded by taxpayers. So I wonder if there's some sort of in-between point. Like maybe...
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, maybe...
As a positive example, mRNA research, who funded that? Because it's relatively new, but there wasn't one like monopoly that owned the IP on it, so we had multiple pharmaceuticals coming up with vaccines off of mRNA research.
So I think so it says the concept was developed in 1960. I think the actual like most research, I feel like the actual history of the research is quite longer. It didn't just show up, in 2021. It's been around for decades. It's a good point, though. I feel like a lot of, when it comes to specific compounds, I kind of feel like, okay, I can get patenting that. When it comes to platforms or like CRISPR, I feel like that should not be something that can enable additional innovations. Maybe there's more of a rationale for not allowing that to be patented.
Yeah, it seems a lot like general IP law that you can own your IP, but there's leniency to using other people's IP when it comes to making more innovations and creative works.
Yeah. I kind of wonder if there's a compromise, like, hey, we'll fund this research for you, but this is basically, I'm just trying to think, like, because it is unfair when, they jack up prices to, hundreds of dollars, some medication, the uninsured cost is like hundreds and hundreds of dollars a week, and it's pretty ridiculous. So I don't know enough about that to give a good answer, but
yeah, I was hearing some nonsense I've never heard of before, so I guess I don't know if it's nonsense or not around the coffee. Yeah, does that ever happen to you where someone's telling you a bunch of crazy stuff that you're not well read up on, and you're like, I don't know enough to question you right now? Well, someone was telling me about like the insulin pumps, and the reason why insulin is so much high is because they're not using pig insulin; they're using human insulin because that works better with something or the other.
There's a saying I heard that the amount of time and effort needed to refute BS is an order of magnitude greater than the amount required to produce BS. So, yeah, I don't know anything about insulin.
Yeah, I don't know, but it's a pretty big topic, so that might be worth a deep dive.
So, another thing I hear a lot of people say is like basic research, like why do we fund NASA? Like it doesn't impact our lives at all. I couldn't find hard numbers, but what I will say is basic research is the cat. It's a pipeline. It's like a sales pipeline. Like if you're a salesman, you have a funnel, and you start out by like cold and knocking on doors, and then those become prospects, you develop relationships, blah, 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 and then eventually you close a deal, right? The way I view R&D is like the top of the funnel is basic research. There's tons of cool ideas out there, like lasers. Lasers used to have no purpose. They were just a curiosity. Someone just figured out how to make light go in parallel lines, instead of being scattered in different directions. No use case. Turns out there's tons of use cases. Eye surgery, DVDs don't exist anymore, but weapon systems.
Directed energy weapons are like becoming more real now.
But there's just like lasers are used everywhere. So with NASA, you see a lot of that. You see a lot of like things like Velcro. Well, I don't know if maybe Velcro's not
People always NASA. Bring up Velcro. Like someone wouldn't have already come up with Velcro.
But there's just like all these things that come off and spin out of NASA.
People always bring up the internet was a DARPA project.
Yeah. The internet.
Someone said that's not true.
The internet was 100% government funded.
Yeah.
It was from ARPANET, which is now DARPA. Yeah, just things like, see if there's any good examples.
I mean, there's a lot of use cases of just having satellites in space, for one.
From the Kennedy Space Center website, memory foam mattresses, that technology came from NASA research. Cordless vacuums, GPS. Although GPS was
government Air Force project, but that's kind of the cornerstone of a lot of electronics, and people don't realize that.
Yeah.
If we ever wanted to do a deep dive episode on GPS, I know all about it.
LED lights.
LEDs, really?
Well, a type of
saves
LED.
A lot of energy.
A type of LED. Sky blue LED lights. So there's a lot to it. A lot of things happen, and it's just something people realize is like how much art. I mean, because when you think about the engines of economic growth, there's population growth, and then there's innovation. What else is there, right? I mean, there's obviously like amount of capital, amount of property, plant, but like productivity, most of that's driven by innovation. And innovation starts with R&D, because startups are very important, but most startups don't innovate on R&D. Most startups innovate on business model and use case. So startups, except for like biotech startups, like most startups don't actually do basic research and development. They're mostly.
Oh, really?
Well, think about like, when Facebook started out, what were they doing? They were just building, they were using basic web tools, just coding. I mean, they were building a website.
They didn't really do anything from scratch.
Like even Uber, like none of that technology basically was like already there. They were just putting the pieces together. That's where startups shine, is like innovation in business model, innovation in use case, product design, but they don't do that much R&D. So R&D really is the start of the funnel. When it comes to like how much R&D spending is good, the problem with this question is like, you can't really answer it, because the highest is Israel at 4%. So like, is 6% of R&D better, or 6% of GDP, is that better? We don't really know.
No, overall, I don't know how you would answer that.
Overall, there seems to be a correlation with growth, according to the OECD. Just thinking deductively, there's obviously going to be diminishing returns, because like for every discipline, the sort of community is like, these are the research questions that matter the most. And then if we had extra money, we'd do these things. If we had even more money, we'd do these things. So logically speaking, the most important research, notwithstanding political considerations, the most important research gets done first. And then whatever's next gets done next down the line. So there's obviously gonna be diminishing returns, but it's hard to really say like, where's that line? And also like, you can't make R&D 20% of GDP, because then you're going to be like not making stuff, because, there's always trade-offs. So yeah, I think when it comes to R&D in general is a team sport. People talk about the lone inventor, not super common. Teams, for design patents, lone people seem to do better, according to this paper I found. But generally speaking,
it's rare to find a lone inventor that does something more, make a better mousetrap, or figure out how to make a back scratcher or something small.
So, all these things having been said, there are issues with the current system. So, just off the bat, there's a huge bias against negative results, basically. So, if you're a researcher and you're like, hey, we did, like you're doing your dissertation and you go to like the defense and you're like, yeah, the thing I was trying to prove, turns out I was wrong. So that's my result. Not a good look. But when you think about it, like that is a perfectly valid result. You're like, the null hypothesis was correct. That is a result. But there's a huge bias against that in the research community, which is unfortunate. There's also logically, there's safe research ideas that will get funded. So maybe if you're in a department, you're like, hey, these ideas are going to get us funded, so let's focus on that. I know in biotech, there's a massive focus on cancer, oncology drugs. That's just where the money is. That's what gets funded. So, is that the most important thing? Obviously, cancer research is important. Is it more important than everything else in medicine? I don't know. Funding. So there's a, obviously, as far as like who, corporations funding research, we all know that back in the day, tobacco companies funded research that showed tobacco's not dangerous. Companies funded research showing, sugar is not bad for you. It's actually fat that's bad for you. So that's a thing. There's, funding bias is a thing. What I will say is, the paper's there. You can critique the results and try to reproduce the results and say, hey, we reproduced the results or we failed to reproduce the results. So I think I think it's a thing, but what I would say is like, I don't like it when that alone is used as proof that a paper is not valid, because a lot of companies have valid reasons to fund research. If here's an example. If Boeing wants to, know, they're like, hey, what's the best type of, winglet to add to the end of a wing? Maybe it's more cost effective for them to like fund someone at a university to do that research for them. Is that a bad thing? I mean,
no,
I don't think so. Anyways, I think another complaint you see is that, and I mentioned this before, corporate funding might not be focused on what's important to them.
No.
The next point.
They're spending their own dollars.
Fair point.
They can spend it on whatever they want. I don't think that's as much of a driver as much as does that make the results less trustworthy.
So there was I like short sellers a lot. Do you know what short selling is?
Well, yeah. We all remember the GME. I'm still holding on to my GME stocks.
So
we're gonna squeeze them out.
That's a cargo cult now. They're like, if we just repeat the ritual, the planes will come back to the island. But so basically, there was a paper that was released, I think about some sort of like Alzheimer's drug or something. And these hedge fund guys, and this was like a biotech hedge fund. So these were like people who knew a lot about the subject. They just, for whatever reason, they didn't buy the results. So they really dug into it. And it turns out some of the images in the paper were digitally altered by the people who wrote them. So it was fraud, or like
scandalous.
So these short sellers wrote a report, published it, and the stock for this like company that funded the research or whatever tanked, and they made a ton of money off. So what I will say is, like, if you don't like certain research done by a certain company, the way to counter it is by proving why the results are invalid. Say, hey, we this certain part of the methodology is incorrect, or like we could not reproduce the results. Just saying, Pfizer funded this, so therefore it's invalid. I feel like that's a bit unfair, personally.
Yeah, that would be the wackiest investment scheme startup idea of finding bad research and short selling against them. Funding your own researchers, and then we'll start the first ever negativity bias.
It's almost as crazy as like that Bond movie where that guy like tried to crash that car into an airplane and explode it so that he could like short the airline or whatever.
What Bond movie is that? I don't recognize that at all, but that sounds hilarious.
So another issue, and
Spirit's
this one
safety record is trash.
So this one is so this is my big pet peeve, is like the economics of how a lot of academic journals work. I feel like are a complete racket. So you have these journals where the researchers who submit their papers are not getting paid. The peer reviewers are probably not getting paid. And yet the journal costs an insane amount of money.
Yeah.
To read.
It's ridiculous.
And it's like, okay,
pro tip, if there is a paper you want to read, literally just email the author. Good chance they'll send it to you.
Yeah. But it's insane because it's like, okay, like what does the actual paper do? Unless, except for like find peer review. But it's just like you have an entire...
It's just the gatekeepers, and, there's pomp and circumstance around
and
I'm published in a journal.
And the research might have been funded by taxpayers. So you have...
I know, even worse.
So you have these journals, and then universities have to pay like thousands of dollars for like access to these papers. So when students, go on like JSTOR, it's insane. So my view is like, if a paper was funded by taxpayer dollars, it should be available to everyone. That's my opinion. Other issues, it's tough to make papers double blind in terms of the peer review, because like, yes, you could mask. So obviously you don't know who reviewed your paper. Oftentimes the reviewer gets to know who you are, even when they try to mask that. Let's say tons of your citations are like citations of your own papers. It's like, okay, like we know.
Also, a funny thing that happens there. I was talking to a mutual friend of ours about how he was trying to get his paper published, and his reviewer was the author of basically a competitive algorithm, and asked him to recreate that person's like previous algorithm's results to compare and contrast it, probably hoping to show that his also works.
Yeah, so there's also, I think, peer review can lead to a gatekeeping aspect, not a very transparent system. It's like, so those are some, peer review. So
I don't know what an alternative would be.
That's the tough thing. So peer review didn't become widespread until the 1950s. Before that, a lot of times you had like, a scientist publish a book, like Newton. It's like, these are my great ideas. And then once it's out there, people started, the community started critiquing it. Kind of like how preprints work today, I guess. Mm-hmm. Except I think the one issue with preprints is information travels so fast on the internet that if you have to retract if there's issues, obviously it's not peer reviewed, you have to retract things, it might be too late. And so, you saw a lot of this in the COVID era, where someone put out a paper, a preprint, and there's issues with it. So they tried retracting it. And then the conspiracy theorists would come out and say, oh, they're suppressing the paper. And so, Another comment in post-production, I talked to a friend who works in academia, and he mentioned that some preprint servers don't really allow for retractions. That's not really a thing that happens. So just thought that was some interesting nuance to add. Like, is there some sort of preprint system that, because preprints do have, there is the quality issue where, it wasn't reviewed by, another researcher. So
I think a lot of that's just fixed by people understanding the process a little bit better and understanding the certainty that goes along with it.
So there's this paper that says peer review articles had on average higher quality reporting than preprints, although the difference was small, with absolute differences 5.0% and 4.7% of reporting items in the independent samples and paired sample comparison respectively. So it seems like, I don't know. This is one of those things where, like, I love to complain about the problem, but I don't really have a good solution.
I think it's just fine the way it is. Like, you
few...
can't stop all conspiracy theorists from conspiracying. They'll find a new thing to question.
This is William here making an update to the script. I talked to a friend of mine who's a researcher, and he said that one method of fixing peer review, which is happening in one field particularly, is holding peer review in a public forum so that people are able to kind of witness the peer review process. Here's what I think would be cool. So here's a few things. One is could we create some sort of organization funded by the government or by like a billionaire or whatever? That's like their whole. So there's a couple. So one is there an organization you could build whose whole job is to like try to disprove random research?
Yes, that is something that 100% needs to exist. Just a replication team, and on top of a replication team and people doing meta studies, and there's a great XKCD joke that I want to turn into an article basically about doing a triple blind study where you give the mislabeled data or the incorrect drug to a team that doesn't know, so that researchers themselves are getting like placebo data.
What if you made it like a bounty system where there are these like research bounty hunters and you win a prize if you like disprove someone's research?
Oh my goodness.
And then the other thing is like, how do you get over the negative bias or negative result bias? How do you, like, is there a system that could kind of like...
I mean, half of it's, I think it's just really hard to publish negative results. So that is probably just a cultural stigma that we should just get over.
The last thing is, we already talked about the fraud part. So the president of Stanford a few months ago actually got fired or resigned because one of his papers that I'm sure he didn't do the actual research, but his name was on it, had manipulated results in it. It happens. It's a real thing. It's not a conspiracy. Like, fraudulent data is included on purpose. Usually, I think it's because people feel the pressure to publish. I don't think it's because they have an agenda, but it happens. It's a thing.
100% the pressure to publish. There's someone else that also writes these the joke articles that I write at least once a year, but they put out this book that's just freaking hilarious called Murder by Theory. There's 2 novellas, and one of the novellas followed a research team that had fraudulent data because there was a pressure to publish, and it ended up turning into a murder. It was just so funny, and it was all driven by this pressure.
And the last thing is p hacking. So essentially,
yes.
So the p value is basically, so when you do research, there's a null hypothesis, which is what you're trying to disprove. So the null hypothesis is the thing I'm looking into is not real. So, I have a new drug. The null hypothesis is the drug doesn't work. And so you're trying to disprove that. And so I believe what the p-value is like, if the null hypothesis is true, so if the thing you want to be true is not true, what percent of the time would you get the results that you got? And so, does that sound correct? Some comments to make in post-production here. So I made a small mistake when I was describing p-value. So basically, p-value is if the null hypothesis is correct, what percentage of the time would you get a more extreme result than what you got? So it's not what percentage of the time will you get the result you got. It's that result or a more extreme result. So a minor error, but something worth correcting.
Well, that's sort of right. There's a couple different ways this happens. One is, you can do a lot of selection on what type of data you use in your study. And then on top of that, and this is a thing that I wrestle with whenever I'm developing models in my real world day job, where I have this really complicated data set and I can fit a really high dimensional regression analysis to that data, and you can get a lot of different models on that data set that have significant p-values for each factor, and sometimes they just happen to be that way. You can form your model to say a lot of different things that aren't necessarily true, and
or
you can play a lot of games like that just by picking which factors you include in your model. And really the right way of doing that is to do more sensitivity analysis on what's the effect of including versus not including variables in a regression analysis that a lot of people don't do. I think people overall are getting better about this, but it is still an issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy. Get a result, say, I don't like that result. Add some variables, remove some variables, keep playing it around until
I think the big issue is, if you read most quote-unquote p-hacked academic papers, then there's nothing super suspect in the actual research or the analysis. What becomes suspect is they frame the model and the analysis so that there is at least some sort of conclusion, and then when media report on that study, they don't take all of that complicated analysis and contextualizing of your data, and they just put in the headline. So there's a lot that gets lost in that part of the process, which, the main reason why it's a big issue is if you have all these conflicting headlines just from uncontextualizing your analysis, then people that aren't savvy to the process stop believing that the scientific method is trustworthy.
There's a oh, this is interesting. So our mutual friend, I don't know if we're talking about the same person.
Probably.
But, okay.
Oh, yes, we are.
Yeah. So he sent us an article.
We'll have to have him on here at some point.
Yeah. He'll say no. So this article looks at how common is, p-hacking in different disciplines. And there seems to be a decent amount. It says in most disciplines there are more p-values in the upper than the lower bin. P-values, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they actually kind of create a chart looking at, proportion of p-values in the upper, and you can read the paper to kind of go into more details, but it shows that there's a clear issue there. So it's a thing.
One other thing to note about it is one of the solutions is adjusting the accepted p-value based off of repeated research, because if another way of interpreting the issue is, say if you have a required p-value of 0.05, then that basically means that if you've repeated that same study 20 times, then 1 out of 20 you would get the other result. So if you have repeated research on the same subject and similar data sets, then you really should be adjusting your p-value or your acceptable p-value based off of how often that subject is studied.
So anyways, all those problems having been said, why is research and development and, just academic research specifically, not academic research, but just, scientific or methodical research, why is it so great? And I think the reason is the alternatives suck.
What, you're just going to be fine with society now?
So there's two alternatives. One is just anecdotal experience. Basically, well, this happened to me, therefore XYZ. Problem with that is the number of observations is 1. It's an n equals 1.
You still want that to be a subreddit, an n equals 1.
So
put everyone's anecdotes in.
The problem there is, there's percentages to everything. There's very few areas where like something happens 100% of the time. So even if the number is 99.99%, there's that one person where the thing happens to them. And they'll say, well, it happened to me, therefore it wasn't 90%. But if the number's not 100, then there will be people where that thing happens. And so it just isn't, it's a good starting point to think about like, okay, well, this thing happened to me. I thought that doesn't happen to me. Let's look into the numbers. But anecdotal alone, I'm not a fan of.
No. And it's really hard to argue against anecdotes, weirdly enough, because, when they happen to you or they happen to a friend of yours or somebody then, that weighs more than hard evidence from multiple people.
And the other method is basically hearsay. Well, so-and-so told me this. And I'm like, okay, is so-and-so a valid, knowledgeable person? Probably not. It's probably some random person you're friends with or like your uncle or something. The thing is, like, even for scientifically minded people, that's how most people get their information. Because nobody has time to read papers, outside of, especially if they're not researchers. But even if they are researchers, you're mostly just reading papers about your own field. You just don't have time for academic research. So you eventually have to trust people. So you're like, well, I don't know anything about this field, but this person who I trust says this. And so really this is a question of who do you trust? And is that person a valid person to trust? I think when it comes to issues of a specific scientific topic, some random friend who's not well versed in that topic is not an expert. So, I think what I will say is research does not work well when time is of the essence. So if you're in a startup and you're trying to iterate new product ideas, you can't write papers, do like 6-month-long studies. You have to just keep trying stuff.
Yep, research is slow.
Or if there's a field where you can't run experiments, a lot of policy decisions or political decisions, you can't run that experiment more than once. So that's where, the academic research style of inquiry kind of breaks down. But outside of that, I think it works pretty well. Last few points. So why, if open collaboration works so well in R&D, why does business not operate like that? Why do businesses try to protect their trade secrets and not openly publish and openly collaborate on most things? The answer is money. It just costs a lot of money to run a business. So Amazon's expenses for 2022 were $534 billion, which is the same monetary value as the entire R&D spending of the entire United States. So one company, Amazon, spent as much money as every single organization in the US did on R&D. So these expenses, Amazon has some R&D, but a lot of these expenses are like the cost of, the goods that they're selling, cost for all the salaries, all the benefits, all the buildings that they own or lease. Point is, running a business is very, very expensive, much more expensive than doing research in a lab. So, plus, the people who fund businesses need a return on their investment. Pension funds, retirement accounts, endowments, etc. Academia, on the other hand, a lot of the people who fund them don't need a return. Federal government is not looking for a return. And so that's another big difference. So, another thing is externalities are less of a thing. Positive externalities are less of a thing. If Starbucks is selling you coffee, does that really have positive externalities? Maybe it's a third place, but not really, right? So that whole incentive also kind of goes away. So that's kind of it. Is there anything else that comes to mind before we wrap things up?
No.
All right. Well, that's it for the Unjerked podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe, and see you in a couple weeks.